A car built by a company most of the world still associates with cheap electric hatchbacks just hit 304 miles an hour on a test track in Germany. Not a concept, not a computer rendering. A real, certified four-motor electric hypercar, timed by independent officials, going faster than anything Bugatti, Koenigsegg, or Rimac has ever put on public record. And in the months since, the same car has done something that should have been physically impossible for an electric vehicle its size. It lapped the most feared racetrack on Earth in under 7 minutes, then sold for nearly $3 million at auction to a buyer standing 3 feet away from the company's own chairman. Somewhere in Maranello, Italy, engineers who build cars with a prancing horse on the hood have reportedly been quietly buying tickets to watch this thing drive. This isn't rumor or fan speculation dressed up as news. The car is the Yangwang U9 Extreme, built by BYD, the Chinese automotive giant that is now, by delivery numbers, the largest electric vehicle manufacturer on the planet. The top speed record, 304.5 miles per hour, was set and certified at the ATP Automotive Testing Facility in Papenburg, Germany, the same independently operated, proving ground used to verify record runs by Bugatti and other legacy hypercar makers. The Nürburgring Nordschleife lap time, 6 minutes and 59 seconds, was driven by Moritz Krantz, a professional racing driver, with more than 10,000 laps of that exact circuit, and it beat the previous Chinese brand record set months earlier by the Xiaomi SU7 Ultra, itself a sedan that had already embarrassed several European performance brands on the same stretch of German asphalt. None of this happened in a marketing studio. It happened on the same tracks, new under the same scrutiny, that Western hypercar brands have used to prove their own numbers for decades. If you've never driven anything faster than a rental sedan, it helps to picture what 304 miles an hour actually asks of a machine. Commercial airliners take off around 180 miles an hour. This car was going substantially faster than that, with its wheels on the ground, using nothing but electric motors and battery chemistry that, until recently, most of the auto industry assumed couldn't survive that kind of sustained abuse. 4 separate electric motors, one for each wheel, working together to produce just under 3,000 horsepower. More than double what a Bugatti Chiron makes from a quad-turbo 16-cylinder engine that took decades to perfect. And all of that power is coming from a battery pack BYD calls the Blade, a lithium iron phosphate design the company has spent years marketing as safer and more structurally stable than the batteries most EV makers use, precisely because it doesn't catch fire as output is, on its own, the kind of engineering trade-off most manufacturers would have called impossible a decade ago. Quickly, before going further, here's where things stand 2 minutes in. A Chinese automaker most people had never heard of 5 years ago just built the fastest production electric car in the world, verified independently in Germany, and backed it up with a sub-7-minute Nürburgring lap that legacy hypercar brands would kill for. That alone would be a remarkable story. And what that says about who's actually leading this race now. Here's the part worth sitting with, because it reframes everything that follows. For most of automotive history, going faster meant burning more fuel, more precisely, in a bigger engine, refined over generations of trial and error that only a handful of companies on Earth had the institutional knowledge to pull off. Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche didn't get to the top of that mountain by accident. It took them the better part of a century. BYD didn't have a century. The company was founded in 1995, making rechargeable batteries for cell phones, only moved into cars in 2003, and didn't launch its ultra-luxury Yangwang performance brand until 2023. And barely 2 years after that, one of its cars was outrunning machines built by companies with 100 years of racing pedigree behind them. Think about it like 2 athletes training for the same event using completely different playbooks. One spent decades mastering a single highly refined technique, building muscle memory through generations of incremental improvement, the way a violin maker passes down exact proportions through a family workshop for 200 years. The other skipped that entire slow apprenticeships and instead brought in an approach borrowed from a totally different sport, 4 independent points of power instead of 1 central engine, and simply out-executed the specialist on raw coordination. That's roughly what happened here. BYD didn't out-engineer Ferrari at Ferrari's own game. It changed which game was being played, and the old rules of what makes a car fast stopped fully applying. The instrument that made this possible, even at a mechanical level, is almost as strange as the top speed itself. It's called DISUS X, BYD's intelligent suspension system. And what it does sounds more like something from a stunt reel than an engineering spec sheet. Using a road scanning sensor system that reads the surface ahead of the car and responds in roughly 40 milliseconds, DISUS X can independently raise or lower each wheel corner in real time. In demonstration videos that circulated widely online, the U9 was shown driving over spike strips and water-filled potholes by briefly lifting all 4 wheels off the ground, essentially making the entire car hop in place to clear an obstacle before landing and continuing to drive. BYD's own product lead has described the system's architecture in 3 layers. A perception layer that reads the road like eyes, a decision layer that processes it, and an execution layer that acts on it fast enough to move the car's body before the hazard is even reached. Critics have pointed out, fairly, that jumping over potholes is not exactly an everyday necessity for most drivers, and BYD itself has leaned into the feature as much for spectacle as for utility. But the underlying capability, adjusting each wheel's ride height independently in under 50 milliseconds while carrying nearly 3,000 horsepower, is a genuinely difficult engineering problem. And it's the same active suspension foundation that let the Extreme Edition hold its composure at nearly 500 kilometers an hour on a track that punishes the smallest imperfection in body control. The party trick and the record-setting stability come from the exact same underlying system. Now, here's the part that turns this from an impressive spec sheet into an actual industry crisis for the companies that used to have this space to themselves. Ferrari has not been quiet about watching this unfold, and not in a flattering way for them. Photographs circulated in 2025 showing a Xiaomi SU7 Ultra, another Chinese electric performance sedan that had just posted a Nürburgring time faster than a Porsche Taycan, parked outside Ferrari's own Maranello headquarters, apparently there for the company's engineers to study directly. Around the same time, Reuters reported that Ferrari had quietly pushed back its second all-electric model from 2026 to 2028, with sources telling the outlet that demand for high-performance electric vehicles was proving far softer than the company had planned for. That delay matters more once you see what Ferrari's own first electric car actually offers, next to what BYD has already put on the road. Ferrari's debut EV, unveiled in February 2026 and built with design input from former Apple design chief Jony Ive, carries a top speed of roughly 310 kilometers per hour, about 193 miles per hour. That's a genuinely quick car by any ordinary measure, and by most reports, its early sales have actually outperformed skeptics' expectations. But it is not a hypercar chasing top speed records, and it is not in the same conversation as a machine that has already been independently timed at over 300 miles an hour. Ferrari CEO Benedetto Vigna has described the company's approach as adding electric power as one option alongside combustion. In hybrid models, rather than racing to match extreme EV performance numbers, which is a reasonable strategy for protecting a 100-year brand, but it also means the fastest car in the world right now doesn't wear a prancing horse, and hasn't for over a year. If you're wondering whether this was a fluke, a single over-engineered flagship built to grab headlines once and disappear, the sales numbers argue otherwise. And this is where the story gets almost stranger than the speed record itself. At the 2026 Beijing Auto Show, a single Yangwang U9 Extreme sold for over 20 million yuan, roughly $2.76 million, the most expensive transaction recorded at the entire event, with BYD's own chairman, Wang Chuanfu, personally handing the car over to the buyer. Only 30 units of the Extreme were ever built. This is a company that spent 2 decades building its reputation on affordable, mass-market electric cars, deliberately stepping into a price bracket that used to belong exclusively to Bugatti, Koenigsegg, and the most exclusive end of Ferrari's own lineup, and finding buyers willing to pay millions for the privilege. It's worth remembering just how recently that reputation shift happened, because the timeline is genuinely compressed even by the standards of an industry that moves fast. As recently as the early 2010s, BYD was mostly known outside China, if it was known at all, for budget-friendly compact EVs and municipal bus fleets, the kind of vehicle nobody expected to show up on a Nürburgring leaderboard. The standard version of the Yangwang U9, the one without the extreme upgrades, only launched in February 2024, packing 4 motors and roughly 1,300 horsepower, itself already enough to embarrass most gasoline supercars on a straight line. The jump from that debut model to a 304 mile per hour, 3,000 horsepower record holder took less than 2 years. For comparison, it took Bugatti roughly 2 decades of incremental engineering, starting with the original Veyron in 2005, to work its way up to the speeds its later hypercars are known for today. Quickly, halfway through this, here's the piece that should actually unsettle you more than the top speed number. This isn't a story about one impressive Chinese car. It's a story about the balance of power in an industry that hasn't meaningfully shifted in a century, quietly tipping in real time, while most of the world was still repeating outdated jokes about Chinese manufacturing. BYD didn't just build a fast car, it proved, on tracks Western brands have used to define their own legitimacy for generations, that the century of institutional advantage those brands relied on can be closed in roughly 5 years if you're willing to rebuild the entire approach to performance from the ground up instead of refining what already exists. So the real question isn't whether BYD can build a fast car anymore. It's what happens to an industry when the company that used to be dismissed as a battery maker turns out to understand batteries, and therefore performance, better than the people who've spent 100 years building engines. That question gets sharper once you zoom out from BYD's premium Halo car to what the rest of the world has been noticing at the exact same time. China's broader EV industry has been posting Nürburgring times, price points, and technology demonstrations that keep forcing Western manufacturers to respond defensively rather than proactively. Porsche, which pushed harder into EVs earlier than most legacy performance brands, has found itself caught between a Chinese market saturated with cheaper, faster domestic alternatives and Western buyers who, according to Reuters reporting still, overwhelmingly prefer the sound and feel of a combustion engine. Lamborghini, owned by Volkswagen, delayed its first EV entirely until 2029, with the company stating plainly that it doesn't believe the market is ready yet. Ferrari's own shipments fell in China, specifically even before any of this, with a nearly 30% delivery slump in one quarter alone, attributed partly to a broader slowdown in the very market where cars like the U9 are being built, sold, and celebrated as national achievements. Part of what makes this shift so hard for legacy manufacturers to counter isn't just engineering talent, it's structural. BYD makes its own batteries, its own motors, and much of its own electronics in-house, a level of vertical integration most Western automakers simply never built, because for 100 years they didn't need to. A company that started out manufacturing battery cells for cell phones in 1995 was, by the time electric performance became the industry's defining battleground, sitting on exactly the kind of manufacturing base that mattered most. Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche instead had to go shopping for battery suppliers and electric motor partners the same way any other company entering a new field would, competing for the same limited pool of cutting-edge battery chemistry that Chinese manufacturers had already spent 2 decades refining for their own domestic market. That head start is difficult to buy back quickly, no matter how much capital a legacy brand throws at the problem. To be clear about what's actually been proven here and what hasn't, because the honest version of this story doesn't need exaggeration to be remarkable. The top speed record and the Nürburgring lap time are both independently verified, timed by professional facilities and drivers with no financial stake in BYD's marketing narrative. And that makes them about as solid as automotive claims get. What's genuinely still open for debate is how much of this translates into real-world advantage rather than headline-grabbing spectacle. The jumping suspension feature, however technically impressive, has limited practical use on public roads, and even enthusiast outlets that praise the underlying engineering have called the feature closer to a proof of concept than a genuine safety innovation. It's also worth noting that a 30-unit limited run selling for millions of dollars proves there's a market for exclusivity and national pride. But it doesn't yet prove BYD can sustain this level of performance engineering across a mass market lineup the way it has sustained affordability. Building one extraordinary Halo car is a very different achievement than making that level of engineering standard across an entire product line. And BYD hasn't done the second thing yet. There's a longer-term question hiding underneath all of this too. One the racing world has quietly asked itself before, whenever a genuine outsider shows up and starts winning. Records set on closed. Tracks under ideal conditions, with professional drivers and purpose-built test vehicles, don't always translate cleanly into what an ordinary customer experiences on public roads, in traffic, in bad weather, over years of ownership. Legacy hypercar brands have spent decades building reputations, not just for outright speed, but for how their cars age, how their support networks function globally, and how their engineering holds up outside a controlled test environment. BYD's Western service and parts network is still comparatively young, and long-term reliability data for a vehicle this extreme simply doesn't exist yet, because the car itself barely does. None of that undermines what's already been measured and certified. It just means the full verdict on whether this is a permanent shift in the industry, rather than a spectacular opening chapter, is still being written. There's also a fair question about whether comparing a 30-unit, multi-million-dollar limited edition to Ferrari's mainstream electric lineup is entirely apples to apples, since Ferrari has historically reserved its own most extreme performance numbers for similarly limited, ultra-expensive specials rather than its standard catalog. That's a legitimate caveat, and it's worth holding on to rather than flattening the story into a simple story of one winner and one loser. It's also worth remembering that speed records, however rigorously verified, aren't the same thing as brand prestige built over a century, and prestige has its own kind of staying power that a single record run doesn't automatically erase. What isn't up for debate is that the fastest, most extreme production electric vehicle on the planet right now was built in China, tested in Germany, and driven by a European racing professional, and that a century-old Italian brand has, by multiple independent reports, been studying the competition parked right outside its own front gate. So where does that leave the story that started this whole thing, a company once known for phone batteries now holding the outright speed record over Bugatti, Koenigsegg, and Rimac combined. It leaves an industry that spent 100 years assuming performance leadership was something you inherited through decades of engine-building heritage, now watching that assumption get tested by a company that built its entire empire on batteries instead. Whether Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche can close that gap on their own terms, or whether the terms themselves have already changed permanently, is still an open question. Ferrari's early EV sales numbers suggest the brand's prestige alone can still move cars, even at nearly $600,000 apiece, which means this isn't necessarily a story about one side losing everything. But it is a story about a 100-year head start narrowing to almost nothing in under a decade. And every legacy brand in this industry now has to plan around that new reality, whether they're ready to or not. For the first time in living memory, the fastest car in the world isn't wearing a badge that spent a century earning that title. It's wearing one that didn't exist 3 years ago. Tell me in the comments which part actually got you. The idea that a battery company now holds the world speed record over every legacy hypercar brand combined, or the fact that Ferrari's own engineers have reportedly been caught studying the competition parked outside their front door in a race that changed sports almost entirely within the last 2 years.